Rushanara.
Are we spending enough? And so we've established that what the government's going to raise is still not going to be sufficient. And according to the NAO report in March, that publicly funded social care costs are projected to be 25.2 billion a year by 2028 and 34.7 billion by 2038. So despite what's being done and leaving aside the kind of equity considerations and so on, it's still scandalously low for the challenge we face, is it not? And what else should be done to kind of really meet the sort of the challenge that faces an ageing population in this country? For both of you, this question.
So it is lower than we need.
Yep.
And there's no doubt that it's lower than we need. And I think my main reflection on this is that for quite a few years now, every year the Treasury has had to announce additional funds for social care. It seems to me it will be much better to be honest about this, recognise that further funds will be needed for social care and that this is a kind of central part of our role as a community, and therefore to announce them in advance. Mm-hmm. So I think social care would have a much better chance of being well managed at the local authority level if we would say to local authorities, we recognise that we need to spend more on this, and rather than handing that out each year as we go along, let's be honest about it. And so my biggest regret about the SR this year is that there isn't a settlement for the core existing means-tested social care regime that any of us has real confidence will be robust over the next 3 or 4 years. I'm absolutely confident that the Treasury will have to add more money in each year of the spending review period, and that just doesn't seem like a very rational way of doing things. So even if you take a relatively parsimonious view of how much money should be spent, the government's going to end up spending more than it's said so far. So that doesn't seem like a sensible way of proceeding. I think it would be much better to be honest about this. And there is a contrast between social care and the NHS. So I think the position that I described for social care was the position we had for the NHS for many years. There have been periods when there's been a long settlement announced, but also many periods that I can remember in the last 40 years when it's been clear that the amount wasn't going to be sufficient, and so there's been more. That doesn't contribute to good planning. No. And we're already asking our colleagues working in local authority social services to make extraordinarily difficult decisions about who to fund, and not being able to give them a stable and plausible series of budgets doesn't seem sensible. And in all of this, I'd say, of course, these are quite large amounts of money. They're very large amounts of money for any of us as individuals, but relative to the overall level of government budget, or, say, the NHS budget, they're really rather small. Yep. Now, our total current level of spending on elderly adult social care is less than £10 billion a year out of total public spending of £800 billion a year. It's dwarfed by that. It's dwarfed by the NHS. And so somehow it seems to me we haven't got a good perspective on all of this.
Sally, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, just to add a couple of points to that. So I think particularly if we're looking for kind of very long term, so 2038, for example, I think there's a really important thing about how we consider the balance of spend across health and social care needs. So I absolutely echo Andrew's point about local government needs a realistic settlement now. And I was speaking to a council just at the beginning of the week who was saying they assess their cost pressures in social care to be 6% for next year, and they're getting 1.8%. So we kind of see we're not quite on track there. But I think there is something really important when we look about how much we spend as a country on healthcare and social care. We know that will increase every year because as a wealthy country it will. But I think what we've tended to have is a spending pattern that prioritises the acute end of people's needs and isn't being spent on public health prevention, social care support in the community. So for me, the push towards integrated care systems, the new health and care bill creating new statutory organisations is really important, not to save money, but to spend our money in a different way, to really have local integrated care systems be able to think about population population health, how can you change the demand profile? How can you work with communities and use the assets in communities and the assets in public services to shift that? So I think there is a potential with integration of health and care services with a real focus on population health and on inequalities to rethink that balance of spend and to kind of stop what's tended to be the case of social care and public health feeling very much like the poor relation when it comes to overall spending. And then what ends up happening is, as Andrew said, last minute bungs of money have to be given to social care. And over the last 18 months, when we say last minute, we really do mean 1 minute to midnight kind of announcements that grants will be extended or specific pots of money will be extended. That is extremely difficult for local authorities and providers to be able to cope with that kind of last minute decision making.
So just on these points about prevention, public health, integration, collaboration and so on, there have been lots of different attempts in different areas over many decades in trying to do that, and it seems to elude governments of all colours, and I certainly know that prevention and public health is certainly a big issue in areas like mine. So what needs to happen to actually make that happen tangibly, so that we get out of that sort of that characterisation you provided of sort of last minute, both of you provided? What needs to change in terms of incentive structures for government to do it, because it hasn't happened really. I mean, it has a little bit in some governments, governments of some colour than others, but not to the extent that we need it.
I mean, that's sort of the $64 million question, isn't it? How to fix it. I think from my point of view, there's a few things here. One is what's tended to happen before with integration is the concept of a one-size-fits-all. Kind of Whitehall determines what it thinks integration looks like and says to everybody, you must do this. With integrated care systems, actually, there's a huge amount of local flexibility. So there's it proposed in the bill. So there are some minimum requirements about an integrated care system, but then also a lot of flexibility about how integrated care systems then work with their places and communities within their footprint. And we at the King's Fund think that flexibility is really, really important, because what's going to work in South East London is not going to work in Cornwall. So we kind of really want to see that flexibility, which is an important signal of maturity in a health and care system that you can kind of trust local. I think the really important thing that needs to happen is what do we consider success to mean for integrated care systems? So if we only focus on waiting times and A&E waits, the system will shift all of its resource, all of its people, all of its focus to that. If actually what we have is a properly integrated performance framework that's looking at long-term trends in life expectancy, quality of life, mortality, alongside the patient experience of more immediate access to care, that's really important. So a lot of this will come from local leadership, but it will critically be set by the tone from Whitehall and from NHS England about what matters.
So just on that, over the last decade, what we've seen is a tendency for national government to talk a good game about localisation and devolution, but then pass the responsibility but not the appropriate funding. And in social care, what we are seeing is, I mean, the government's already said in its plan that we expect demographic and unit cost pressures will be met through local council tax, social care precept and long-term efficiencies. And it is reasonable to expect so is it reasonable to expect the spending pressures from changing demographics to be met from these sources, given what we know about different wealth levels, regional inequality, the cuts that local authorities have faced over the last decade? And my local authorities had £200 million taken out of his budget. That's just one local authority. Up and down the country, Conservative, Labour, whichever colour local authority, they've really struggled. So, what would you say to this sort of passing of responsibility, but not the appropriate resources, and thinking through that equitably? What's the implication of that on the care agenda?
So I don't think council tax is an appropriate base to pay for social care, because where you can raise the most council tax doesn't tally to where there is the most social care need. So I think that, yes, obviously it is a locally delivered service, so it's reasonable to be thinking that local government should be trying to ensure that as good a value for money as possible. But I personally think we need to see more grants from central government to local government around social care. So we do have a few of those. We also have some arrangements where the NHS contributes to social care costs through the Better Care Fund. So there are some steps on those, but they tend to be at the margins of the overall budget, whereas I think local government need to have more support from central government. So we're confident that the right money is going to the right places to pay for care needs, rather than thinking overall we can raise money through council tax, but it will end up in the wrong places.
So Andrew, did you want to comment on
I
anything?
think the only thing I'd add is that, I think all that Sally says is correct. I think I'd just like to step back and repeat again that it looks as though this government will deliver a significant increase in long-run spending on social care. Mm-hmm. That will be the first time that's happened in the 40 years that I've been working in this general area. Now, there is, as we've already discussed, a whole set of areas, particularly yesterday's announcement about which I feel very uncomfortable. But it is striking that's the first time this happened over a very long time. And I think what that points to is that social care, and here I think we all have to recognise responsibility, simply hasn't attracted political or public or media interest and support in a way that is proportionate to its needs. So I do think that the current funding settlement is inadequate. I think it's inadequate to deliver appropriate integration, because integration is the kind of structural reform that relies on people having some flexibility and slack. But I do think that that's a problem that we need to recognise implies criticism of all of our institutions and all of us.
Yeah.
So while I'm critical of some aspects of what's being done at the moment, I also want to give credit to this government for actually having the courage to try to increase spending in this critical area. And I think we all need to reflect on why something as important and central to all of our lives and to what kind of community you are as social care simply hasn't had the kind of political, public and media support that it needs if it's to be done well. And we won't, for example, do integration well until we have the right levels of budgets.
So I just on that, the very, very important point and well made, and successive governments have tried to bring this debate to the fore, but for different reasons haven't. Despite the fact that the grey vote has so much clout and power, which is interesting. But just in terms of looking into the future, obviously this is a good place to start from. And for those of us on the left, we want to see, certainly I'd want to see much more equality across regions, across populations, and so on. Those distribution points that were made earlier. But in terms of if you were to build these proposals into being something better and sustainable for the future, so that we don't run into this difficulty 40 years hence and we're still kind of having these debates about neglecting care for adult social care, elder care and so on. What would you do sort of systemically in terms of budgets and to address these equity considerations, and particularly the regional ones, because we're going in the wrong direction, frankly. When what we're seeing is people who are poorer, who are going to need care, are going to be hit even harder, regardless of these changes. Which, in some, of course, as you say, it's better to have them than not. But how do we get to a better place as a society where we can actually solve this crisis rather than having to do this incrementally?
I suppose perhaps this may sound like a counsel of despair, is I don't think this is a crisis capable of solution, because I think that the trends and pressures will continue in perpetuity, just as they have in the NHS. I think what we can hope to do, expect to do, require ourselves to do, is do much better, serve people's social care needs much better, serve the needs of providers in this space much better. And I think the immediate step we need to take is to provide an adequate level of funding to the existing needs-tested system. Until we can do that, we will be asking employees in social services departments around the country to make decisions that would try Solomon, that we simply haven't got enough resource going in to make reasonable decisions there. I think that's critical. Having done that, we need to have there's an impact that we need to deliver, but we also need to deliver a guarantee, a promise of reasonable budgetary availability over enough time for people to be able to plan. Then I think we have, with the structures, as Sally said, I think the structures that are being put in place can be really effective. We have a chance with this structure which removes catastrophic risk from people, that the providers will for the first time have a structure within which they can innovate and invest. And our best chance for doing better in all of this is a combination of adequate budgeting and innovation. This sector hasn't changed very radically in the way it delivers care, despite significant technological feasibility, which at the moment isn't being brought in because there simply isn't the money. So I'm not despairing about the future, but to get there, we all have to recognise how important this is. We have to deliver appropriate resources, and then we need all public and private sector to work very hard at doing it better. I think that can be done, but I think to achieve all of that, the sector and the activity needs a different kind of a profile. And there are all kinds of interesting questions about why we don't talk about this very much. That could be to do with fear, that we can see this coming at us. The fear, I think, can somewhat be tackled by pointing out that if you ask people receiving social care how they feel about their lives, actually their self-reported life satisfaction is in many cases very high. Needing social care doesn't mean that you're condemned to a miserable life. Quite the reverse. So I think we need to point out that this can be a good thing. But of course there are aspects of social care that people do find unpalatable. We don't like talking about incontinence. And I think we need to do better at addressing head-on some of the challenges that are to do with social care to give it a higher profile and a better profile.
I think the one area I'd add to give a sort of practical example of if your ambition is that we more consistently fund the social care system well. I think one key issue at the moment is the lack of data we have about the social care system. So if you compare social care with the NHS, we have very, very little data, which can make it very hard to make a case to Treasury about what do you get in return for this money, but it's also very hard to then articulate the benefits and the value of the adult social care system. So just as a couple of examples, we know very little about self-funders at the moment. We will start to know more about them because of the cap cost system. They will now start to interact with the state. So that's a really good opportunity to understand what's going on with those people's needs, how are they meeting their needs, how are providers meeting their needs. We also know very little about unmet need. So we know how many people come to a council to ask for help. We know how many of those get turned away being given absolutely nothing. But we don't know what they then do, how do they meet their needs. We don't know how many people might never have even come to the council. So there's a whole set of unknowns that are really challenging then to be clear, what are you investing in when you're investing in social care? And I think it is really important that we can too often kind of be doom and gloom and it's a problem and there's a funding gap, but also there's huge opportunities. 1.5 million people work in the social care sector. It makes a massive contribution to local economies up and down the country. There's huge innovation in some parts of the market, huge value in social care, but we don't always have the data to be able to show the potential for that and therefore show why it should be prioritised amongst other competing pressures at a spending review.
Thank you very much.